excited about it. And anyone who has had the chance to look it over is, I know, excited about it. And we're going to be starting with a few announcements, as we often do at the beginning of any event. And then we'll get on to introducing Rick. He doesn't really need any introduction here. I think most of us know him, consider him a supporter and friend, and a long-time involvement with Bookstore One Sarasota. But we're going to use the publisher's write-up for the book and also for Rick, because we want to make sure and know what the full background is. Before we do, I want to tell you about Poetry Mike coming up. That's kicking off in January. And Bubba Henson and Liz Posen are going to be the first readers up at the Poetry Mike. And also, we've got some really fabulous news about Poetry Life, which has been our annual experience with poetry. And this year, it's going to be particularly amazing. In March, details are still on the way. I had to go to the, even though I know a little Gaelic, I had to go to the web and have some help pronouncing his name. But Padraig Otwana is going to be one of our poets for that. And then from Georgetown University, we're going to have Carolyn Forche. And that's been looking forward to that for a long time. So that's amazing. As mentioned, I'm going to get us reacquainted with Rick's introduction here in a minute. But first of all, the publisher has given us a good intro to his book, My Roberto Clemente. It begins with an invigorating homage to childhood baseball idol and legend, and ends with an appreciation to an anonymous man, possibly a retired circus clown or sideshow freak, feeding pigeons in Washington Square Park, who sits as still as any public statuary, as if any one of our blue lives depend upon it. And how much our lives depend on the many discovered mercies, small and large, that this poet brings to our fortunate and ultimately grateful attention in My Roberto Clemente. My Roberto Clemente is a collection that turns to the recuperative powers of poetry in the midst of the various dark forces bearing down on us to draw more strength and resilience, even delight. That's so beautiful. I don't know that I need to say anything more, except let Rick read. But here's Rick's vitae, you might say. He's the author of Brother, and how do you pronounce that, Rick? Salvage?
Salvage.
Salvage, okay. Winner of the 2005 Agnes Lind Starrett Prize and named 2006 Poetry Book of the Year by Forward Magazine. And Map of the Lost World, that came out in February of 2012, listed as a top pick on Library Journal's website, both with Pit Poetry series. His most recent full-length collection, My Roberto Clemente, won the 2020 Winter Soup Bowl Chapbook competition. Among his honors are Writers Award, the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Scholarship, and fellowships from the Camargo Foundation, Cassis, France, the Stegner Program at Stanford, the Institute for Creative Writing at UW-Madison, and the Fulbright Program. His poems, translations, and essays have appeared or will soon appear in Field, Harper's, Kenyon Review, Paris Review Poetry, The Nation, The New Republic, and other publications. He is an associate professor of English at Vanderbilt University, where he teaches in the English department and the Masters in the Fine Art program in creative writing. Let's give Rick a hand. Oh, we even got shouts and yells. That's great. That's terrific. Well, I'll be back with questions in my own little intro, but I'm really excited to hear Rick read some of his poems, whether from the new book, or I think he was referring to another poem that he wants to present to us.
Sure, sure. Doug, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. Even if some of it was a little familiar, in your warm voice, it all sounded just so beautiful. So thank you. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to also thank Andrea Ginsky, James Mamone, or is it Mamone if we're in Italy?
Mamone.
Mamone, okay. And everyone at Bookstore One for taking the care necessary to make this event even possible. I do want to give special thanks to George DeCourt and Robin Radin for being such wonderful hosts, as always, to me and to my sweetheart, Stephanie Elizondo Grist, who I'm making a quick plug for. She's a wonderful writer, so please read her work, okay? Stephanie Elizondo Grist, look at the right time for me to say it twice. Anyway, I wanted to thank all of you. I should say too, at some point, my mom is going to watch this, I think when it's a recorded event. So, hi, Mom. There's a wonderful line of poetry by the Hungarian poet Attila József. The title is his name, and the first line is, Attila József, I love you. It is something I learned from my mother. And so I do want to thank mothers, all the mothers who are here, the fathers who have mothered, those who have mothered without being a mother or father. I thank you so much. Oh, I should also thank my brother and sister, Ross, Stephanie. Love you both so much. Also, can I just say, there are bound to be some people here I may not know, or people who are watching this who I don't know yet. And thank you. All of your ears and your attentions are shaping this. And I can't be more grateful for your attention and your time. I hope to make as much of it as we can. And I think maybe a half hour of reading poems, and then however much time you all would like just to talk, okay? So thank you for that. I suppose on the theme of mothers, perhaps, I wanted to read an elegy that I wrote for a dear friend, a wonderful poet named Jean Valentine, who died last December, so not quite a year ago. Jean kept a pocket Emily Dickinson book, like literally a pocket-sized one that Brenda Hillman had edited for Shambhala Press. If any of you, if that interests you, just go get it or order it online. And get it through Bookstore One, Sarasota, please. It's a wonderful book. And she actually, was interesting. She'd signed a book of mine and gave me a bookmark. And on the bookmark was this line of Emily Dickinson, so that I came upon, almost seemed randomly, and then to some extent seemed kind of fated, to kind of trigger this poem, or at least it triggered the poem for me. This line, the sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can. So I'm calling this a late Valentine for Jean Valentine. The sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can. Emily Dickinson. You set the needle down on the page, and the whole room trembled. The fireflies flashed in the periphery, the air singed as if from distant fires, delivering the news, the shock of recognition. new depths of love that we might come to know. That music that so enthralled you, you held it close enough for us to hear. Now we have the shells, the casings, emptied and scattered, strewn along beachfronts at the end of a terrible year. To hear you now, we must hold the whole world up to our ears.
Mm.
Sweet people. You know, as I was thinking, it made me think a little bit. I think there's a line of W.H. Auden's where he talks about, you know, people who love poetry tend to be the people who, when reading the Bible, love the begat section of like so-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so. And well, one way I take that, I mean, we can take it in many ways, but one way I think of that is how many people it takes even to get us into any one moment. You know, like there's so many people that we are thankful for. I said a number of thanks, but there are inevitably so many more people that I would thank ideally. And I suppose one of them, you know, found his way into the title of this book, Roberto Clemente, who, well, you'll see in this poem, the title poem to the collection, which is the first poem in the collection. He meant a lot to me. I think he's meant a lot to many of us over the years. I think that's a beautiful image of him too. So, my Roberto Clemente. Doesn't everyone need a charm like a lucky rabbit's foot, but something with the power to transform, even mutate in ways that might save us, especially when all the rules have changed? In those first board games of childhood, when house rules so often meant the power to change the rules at the house's whim, you needed your own hand-sized, get out of jail free jetpack of transformation. You needed a Roberto Clemente, your own ace in the hole. As a kid, I put down my best baseball cards when I saw my friend put up his Roberto Clemente, the Puerto Rican Willie Mays, who was so devoted to his homeland, Puerto Rico, that he went to Managua himself to deliver earthquake relief. And now that children are donning adult clothes, how to prevent them from running roughshod over us, but by devising our own emergency trump cards. But how to take this metaphor to the next level? What's your Roberto Clemente? What's your ace in the hole? What's one thing that no one can take from you? One thing not even hitmen can destroy. Sure, they can lace you with nerve agents and bone saw you all the way from the Red Sea to the Bosphorus. But once you say your piece and make peace with it, neither can be undone. You might ask, but what if I'm not around to play my Roberto Clemente, my ace in the hole? The words keep doing what you've taught them to do. The Puerto Rican Willie Mays keeps hitting another home run through the entire Anglo-Saxon tradition, as Lawrence Ferlinghetti said. Never mind, they never found his body in the wreckage of the DC-7 he insisted on writing, so one more plane delivering relief to Managua would not be diverted by one more corrupt politician, as were the first 3 planes. What mattered to Clemente was that the resources got to where they needed to go. That's why we remember him and forget the rest. So what's your Roberto Clemente? What's your ace in the hole?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. I'm in a room full of love, so I hope some of it is making its way to you. What a glorious thing. You know, I was talking to a number of people I know in the community about being here in Sarasota now, and I have to say, it's been magical to go both on walks and to go kayaking with my sweetheart, Stephanie, in the bayou into the marina, walking sort of along the water. There is this sort of great feeling of presence, just walking by water that is rippling, and you have this sense that like, oh, maybe now I will see the manatee, but often, well, at least lately, the manatees are not appearing, although we did see one, we're pretty sure, yesterday by none other than Catherine Harris's house. I can't, I don't know that there's a connection, but at least in terms of geography there was. But I have a poem about sightings, about seeing things. Actually, Doug made reference to a poem called Seeing Things that was in the collection until recently. I had to take it out because a journal had accepted it and couldn't publish it in time for the book. I guess these things happen. But this poem, Sightings, is in the book, and I really would like to read it to you. Sightings. What's the most unforgettable experience you ever had among the creaturely? I keep circling back to a beach in St. Augustine. Sunset, a light of halved peaches saturating everything. Walking the shoreline, no sense of anything but my joy. When maybe 20 feet offshore, my eyes focus on a dorsal fin. I hear the two-note theme from Jaws. But then another surfaces, a smaller dorsal fin. And for a time, we move, it seems, as one organism, the white water wrinkling, webbing the edges of our worlds. Who knows how far we traveled together, or if anything like language passed between us. But such magnetism. The larger dolphin even seemed to bow before they swam away. I love that sort of thing. It seems to be happening constantly in Sarasota. Like my sweetheart Stephanie and I went for a little walk just maybe an hour ago, and I suppose one can put all the little lizards one sees into that category. You see them, and almost as soon as you see them, they are gone. They feel like these visitations, these reminders of things we need to take care of, and to be more mindful of. I can't quite tell if this particular mentor of mine is with us. Oh my gosh, I do see friends. It's so lovely. Even my brother is here. It's so sweet. But I'm going to read this poem that has a skyhook or an epigraph from a poet who I worked with, and still very much with us, and writing up a storm, working on a new and a selected poems. Her name's Grace Schulman. I just adore her. Hey, Pat, nice to see you. Welcome. You look great. Beautifully coiffed. So just in time to hear a poem called To the Language Spoken in the Country of Urgency. Okay. This poem has this skyhook from Grace Schulman. And this is actually from a poem she was writing about a family friend of hers who happened to also be named Marianne Moore, who some of you would have heard of, the great modern poet who wore a tricorner hat sometimes, was a dear friend of her family. And at some point, Grace ended up being her literary executor and publishing her collected poems. But I love this idea of countries of urgency, that in the country of urgency, there is a language, is Grace Schulman's line. And I just found myself thinking about those moments when we might communicate out of exigent circumstances without it being shaped consciously, but maybe shaped just by the urgency. And I have an experience here that I write about that I think speaks to that. So, to the language spoken in the country of urgency. I must have said something to the man in my confusion when I put my hand on his shoulder long enough for a cement truck to breeze by. It would have killed him instantly, I think, when the light changes and its change falls through our long shadows, spreading the news of sunset over our faces and the wet streets, and we, the temporary single organism of crowd, begin again to cross the street. When the man turns to face me now and asks if I know Arabic, I say, I wish. Because just then, he says, it sounded a lot like you were calling me by name in the language of my other mother country.
Mm.
Such a moment. Oh my gosh. Who knows what to follow that poem with, but I guess I've decided to follow it with this poem. This is called Sex After 50. That may be a bit of a non sequitur, but I'm going to dedicate it to my sweetheart. You can't see her book, but I can. This poem does have another dedication. It's for a friend who on his 50th birthday received a book with this title as a gift, which when opened revealed that all of the pages were completely blank. Travesty. It must have been put together by a 49-year-old. So, Sex After 50. It's a lot better than you might think, especially if the thought of it makes you a little queasy. For one thing, your looks are just starting to get interesting, and everything else that's starting to sag, wilt, whatever, was never really what it was about in the first place. While it may be nice to dream that you will just lean into the splendor of sensations and total darkness, most times it's better to leave a light on and reflect on how much more comfortable you are in your skin, not to mention somebody else's. So, while you're still holding the universe in place on its axis, the two of you now pinned to each other and your shadows, holding everything, including even the outmoded notions that could use a little more entertaining these days, like the music of the spheres, which will sing its immortal shape into you a little more each time come to know love and rapturous sex after 50. Oh boy. So it's the kind of poem I think we all should write every 5 years, you know? Or every decade, or every day. I don't know. There should just be many volumes. Next, I did begin by talking a bit about mothers. I should also say my sweetheart's mother, Irene, is listening, and I want to make a big shout out to her. I'm a product of, divorced family, what James Merrill called a broken home, the broken home. And, I see myself very much as, raised by women, raised by my mother, her mother largely, and certain other men too, pretty gentle men. My father would become a wonderfully gentle man, I should say, especially in the last 15 years, 20 years, even a little longer. I guess I want to say too, my dad has pneumonia at the moment. He's in an elder care facility and has been going back between there and a hospital. So maybe I'll dedicate, some of this time together to him, and maybe some of the good energy that we're hopefully compiling together. We wouldn't mind sending some of that his way. Actually, pretty close to Jane in Akron. It's close to Akron, in Canton,
Oh, okay. Well, think of him and give him thought.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to read this poem. It's another elegy to a teacher of mine, a graduate school teacher who, at one point called me her revenge, which I thought was an amazing word. And she said, well, I said, well, what do you mean? I mean, I love being your revenge, but what do you mean? And I guess I was the third of her students to get a Stegner Fellowship, and she had applied 3 times and didn't get one, but had 3 students who did get a Stegner to Stanford. It's a marvelous experience, but you know, this wonderful poet died at 61 of a brain cancer, and her name's Lucy Brock-Bordeaux. She died on March 6th, I believe, 2018. So I wrote this poem kind of in her style, the way I did the one to Jean Valentine. So she would sometimes title poems with a playful kind of encompassing, capacious, kind of slightly ridiculous, humorous kind of thing. So this is called the perplexities of time and space at last explained. And then in parentheses, eventually, maybe despite rain delays. So anyway, that has kind of the air of one of her titles. But so here's the poem. See what y'all can make of this. I've cashed in my cathedral quiet for a few well-worn African drums, and a Senegalese Punic mask that I was gifted, I believe, by oblivion. After talking with a magical friend over an ordinary dinner one night in New York City, then walking home alone in the bustle of midsummer urban darkness, I heard the sound of something. Had it been thrown from a passing car or fallen from a great height? Who can say? But picking it up, I saw a hand-carved face of an African woman at rest, the skin painted a ghostly white, the black carvings of her hair, an image that I learned only later is meant to bring its bearer to the end of grief. Now that I have enjoyed its companionable silence for a whole year, I give it to you now, that you might know its living medicine, like a blank page, preparing for the soul that will seek refuge on it. May you receive its bounty, inexhaustible as it is delicious. You, with your husky lounge singer voice, tongue-tied from twirling cherry stems into gift bows, with your immaculate tobacco mouth. My teacher loved to smoke, and you could always smell it on her, and I kind of loved it. My mom had been a smoker. I love smoking in poems. In restaurants, not so much more, but in poems, I love it. None of the smoke affects us in awful ways. So anyway, that goes out to Lucy Brock-Bordeaux. Tongue-tied cherries. Yeah. So we mentioned earlier, for those of you who are just kind of coming in like Pat, we're in kind of a palazzo here in Georgia Court's astonishing home. And you can kind of see this flying carpet above us that she had installed. I was here actually when it was installed. There was a scaffolding and 4 or 5 men, installing it, and it was pretty remarkable. And to my knowledge, it has been there absolutely in place ever since, probably going on 5+ years now. At any rate, I have a poem called The Flying Carpet. This rug does not appear in this poem, but it's a sort of trigger. I suppose it's a little bit of the triggering subject that gives me permission to read this poem to you. So, The Flying Carpet. It hovered just above the surface of the earth, the carpet that moved like an unearthed piece of sidewalk, an inch above the sidewalk, the shadow sidewalk moving, but made up entirely of ants, a shadowy rectangular cauldron, moving now almost impossibly upstairs toward him in the small Guatemalan village where he lived that summer, where scorpions seem to find you everywhere, appearing sometimes only when you've forgotten them, crawling into view on the undersides of, say, kitchen tables. His hammock kept him safe, unless he saw one on the ceiling or stepped on one. Once he found a deadly one on a loose roll of toilet paper he'd grabbed without looking first. A mistake he'd never make again. So he was always tripwire taut now, ready to snap when he caught sight of the carpet of ants, ascending the fieldstone steps, hugging the edges without stopping in the midday heat, which could play with your mind anyway and leave you like an exposed nerve, even when you've slept. They were just beyond his lengthening shadow when he leapt to his feet, grabbed the bucket of last night's rainwater and threw it on the teeming army of ants, making them scatter at once into the lush, tall grasses. That night, he met some friends for drinks and told them all about his encounter with the low-flying carpet of ants and how he dispatched them with a pail of water. When one local said, "The carpet of ants? That's about the only thing that will rid your house of scorpions." Then the man said, just earlier that season, he'd seen one of the deadliest scorpions taken down by such an overflowing swarm. He said it was like watching a great castle sink into the sea, its despot still in the ramparts, surveying the wreckage as the assailing generations bring him down.
Wow.
That's a
That's
beauty.
cool.
I think I need a cigarette after that. There's
Dr. E.O. Wilson is smiling.
Oh man, to make Dr. E.O. Wilson.
While you have a sip of that, Rick, I'm going to cut in with just an advertisement.
Oh, please.
Make sure that you get your orders in, and which you can do online to our bookstore website for there. Look at that, boy. Say it and it appears. And get a copy of Rick's new book on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My understanding is that there are 5 copies in the bookstore, and more can be ordered.
I have this funky one right here that I printed out.
For those of you who can't afford a copy,
Yeah.
you can figure something out, right? Let's see now. How are we doing time-wise? Reasonably well. Do we have time for one more or a couple more?
Oh, of course.
Yes.
Yes.
Sure. So I was thinking, some of you may be wondering things like, well, how did every book seems to have its own thing precipitating it, and some things are probably entirely unconscious to us, and I like it that way, actually. I love it when books reveal their necessity, sometimes slowly over time, and even with, my other 2 books of poetry, the last poem seemed to be it was the longest poem often, and the title poem in both cases. And it seemed like whatever it was, like that moment the Greeks call aletheia, or the moment of unhiddenness, like I felt like I had my aerial view of those books with the last poems. And in this case, I don't know about you guys, but certainly, during the last presidential election, I should say now 2 presidential elections ago, I felt pretty sad. I was feeling like a certain kind of toxicity of language was taking over and dominating. And I needed to kind of turn to the poem every day, every morning, as a way of recalibrating myself to language, to beauty, to hope, to words like truth, to words like meaning, to love, to everything that I hold dear, in a world where sometimes what seems like is real are the nefarious things. I needed to remind myself that really what is real is the things that we live for. Love, love of, our beloved, the love, our friendships, those friends who are our beloveds, the friends that become a kind of extended family, including the families we come from, biologically. Anyway, I needed that, and that certainly fed into this book. But one poem that I wrote, it was remarkable. Say when I was writing, hey Kurt, welcome, nice to see you. Good to have you aboard. Anyway, I was writing a lot of odes, and I found myself writing odes to things I don't know that I would necessarily praise, but I found like in this daily act of writing, it gave me cause, it gave me a kind of sort of spiritual, cognitive work to find praise in something I couldn't necessarily praise, you know. So this poem is called To Misunderstand, you know, which I turned into an ode, I think. To misunderstanding. On the radio today, a neurologist identified the most important capacity of the human brain as being its capacity to contemplate a self beyond the self. Even the interviewer was not so sure he understood what his guest just said when he asked the specialist to explain it all again. I was not sure how the man would make his point again. So with thousands, possibly tens of thousands, invisibly listening along with me, we all leaned in like silence itself to the radio voice, who then told us all about the brain's plasticity. He had doubted it himself, he said, for many years, decades really. He'd heard a colleague assert the theory 30 years or so before. A crank, he said, who he knew now had been a visionary all along, and led him to the realization that he'd been wrong about all he'd known about the brain. Being able to see beyond one's earlier position, that point of view, was the key that freed him to reject each former hypothesis that he'd maintained. This was the brain at any age, making new connections, and to abandon old neural connections for new pathways seemed the hallmark, the very hallmark of consciousness and our humanity. But how many of us ever really see past a prior understanding and abandon it completely? This man of science moved me most when he finally admitted how wrong he'd been in every other hypothesis he'd made, moving unknowingly from error to error without a sense of progress is what made him become himself. Even if all our work seems like nothing but the sum of all our errors, it will have been good to share our work, nevertheless.
Mm. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's good to hear them read by the poet. Yeah. I'm struck by the fact that you picked my favorite. It's hard to have a favorite in Rick's book because every one of them, in fact, I wrote down not only 5 questions to ask him, but 6 lines, 6 quotes from various poems, and realized I couldn't exhaust them. So it's definitely, it may be a chapbook, and you know, we usually think of that as being just a bit thinner than the usual collection and fewer poems, but it's not easily exhausted, and I just really appreciate it. For me, I have to say that I had a humorous image in my mind of being a boy in 1960, and a number of us Yankee fans were leaving and deserting the Yankees for the Pirates. It's possible that, you know, many will not remember Roberto Clemente, but what you have done is wonderful in memorializing him and giving us a key to unlocking a way of living.
Thank
Beautiful.
you. Thank you.
I have a personal question or two to ask you, Rick. Given the events of the past 2 years, how would you say and you alluded a bit to it, but how would you say the crisis has impacted your writing, and especially the situation at the university you teach at?
Oh, these are great questions. Well, the university part, I should say, I have I have this kind of remarkable condition, you might call it. It's called being on sabbatical. So I've been on sabbatical for all of 2021.
Wonderful.
With those 2 years. I know it's a phenomenal thing. One should be so lucky to have many in one's life. And at any rate, so I felt extremely lucky to be on sabbatical, to be able to finish a book. I fell in love during sabbatical. A lot of amazing things have happened, but I've had to cling very closely to this writing process, to really what started the poems of this book, really a daily practice and a deliberate practice of, I once heard John Edgar Wideman give a talk, and he said at the beginning, I write fiction to remind myself that there are other uses for language than to lie. And he said it's a fiction writer. He also writes nonfiction, but he said it as a fiction writer. I've never forgotten that, obviously, but also I think, we come to poetry, we come to instances of language that we go to, the way we go to fresh water, or we go to our beloved, or we go to dear, cherished people, friends, extended family members. And for me, the poem was this refuge, but a refuge of many dimensions, like you would go to it as this sort of blank page. But for me, how to say this, like I found myself approaching writing a bit like the way I imagine, like what Sumi and my sisters kind of approaching a page, at least from what I had heard. We have a specialist here who probably talk about this in a beautiful way later. But what I imagined was like getting to a point, sort of sitting with the page, almost stroking the page with the pen in my hand, and then having a moment of attack, where I would kind of feel myself bubbling over with whatever it was, the necessity of the thing to be written, coming up with the first line. Sometimes I would just read other people's poems. I love that. I love the way there's this, how to say it? I think with poetry, and maybe this is the way it is with life at its best, we are never alone. There are always constellations of, whether there are begats, as I was saying a moment ago, are constellations of gratitude. I've heard some people put it, the people who live on in us, who can't speak because they're no longer on the planet in the same old way, but whose just necessity, like whose presence in us drive us to continue to be our best selves, I certainly felt that as I was writing some of these poems, certainly, or feeling like, I don't know, a teacher calling you her revenge, and no longer being on the planet, or even, again, coming back to our COVID time, which, we can speak of it a bit in the past tense, but it's totally with us. It's absolutely in present tense, isn't it? And so uncertain. I wear a mask, my sweetheart wears a mask. All of us tend to wear masks still and be very, careful. And I think more than ever now, language that is not inflected by the poisons of a certain kind of bilious rhetoric we often hear in political circles, like anything, whether it's fiction like by John Edgar Wideman, or poetry, creative nonfiction, but any of the language of great journalism, anything that I think can bring us to greater clarities about the world, greater inner clarities, is of such value now. But for me, and I know that there are many writers here, and I know the work of a number of you, of course, and I would imagine, you would agree, and you would probably have your own lovely answer to this question too, of thinking about like the necessity of a daily practice, or at the very least a weekly practice, you know, of keeping one hand in the element of poetry, you know, and or feeling like you've just exited a poem. Like, well, Georgia Court, for example, you know, we were talking a bit about her writing practice and her mostly writing a poem every day, you know, and I've been doing that. You know, most of my poems lately are love poems that I send to my beloved ones as soon as they are done, and you know, they're for an audience of one. I like to think that others might be able to read them at some point, but you know, you write the poem, get it to the beloved, and even before breakfast, you might get a reply. You know, that may include many emojis of various degrees of excitement. It's like, what more do you need first thing in the morning, right?
Right.
That's a pretty great
Well,
day. You know?
That really resonates with me, Rick,
Yeah.
because I get that discipline part, and the I guess it's Lehman was the one who coined that the poem a day idea,
Yes.
and certainly the practice, as you called it, of poem writing is something that we try to do in our workshops at the store too.
Yeah.
I have tons of other questions and things to say, but I recognize this group
Yes.
is quite of a remarkable gathering in that many here have insights and reflections that and questions that I'd like to hear.
Yeah.
And we only have a few minutes left, and I want to see who in the group might have something for Rick.
Anybody. Anybody in this room too, I suppose.
You mentioned London Grace.
Oh, yes.
And I haven't heard her name in a long time, and I love it.
Oh,
Dear heart.
thank you.
And salute Grace Coleman. You should be here.
Oh, I don't know if you heard that, Doug. Peter Hooten, who's here.
Oh, Peter.
The wonderful Peter.
Salute, salute.
Yay.
Darling.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and was in, yeah, he was saying that he was very happy to hear Grace Schulman mentioned, and I think, you know, when Peter and James Merrill were together, I mean, I know that you met because actually I talked to Grace about you, and she said she loved you too. Yeah, that you were just such a soul, and yeah, Grace, if you're out there, a lot of love's being beamed to you, and if not, we totally understand. You're in New York after all. But yeah, I mean, if people have questions, great. And if not, Doug, feel free to leap in with one of your 5 or 6. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Peter has something.
The painters who are oftentimes, you go in their studio and they're working on 5, 10,
Yes.
50 canvases at once. You know, having
Yes.
last worked on that 4 years ago.
Yes.
And I think probably you're that kind of poet. You've got several things going
Definitely.
at once.
Definitely.
Always.
Yeah, there's the thing. Yeah, there are many things going. I try to be completely present, you know, when I'm with one, you know, and how to say this? I mean, for those of you who might be listening and maybe, you know, you're at a point with your writing where, I don't know, you've had some silence, or, you know, I hate the idea of writer's block. You know, I've, Carol Muskie Dukes once gave a wonderful workshop called Poetry as Jailbreak. And I love thinking of poetry always as jailbreak. You know, whatever it is that you need to escape, you know, poetry can be a way, I don't think of it as escape so much as a transformation, you know, a way of being a bit transfigured, or absolutely changing your state from within, you know. And
What did Natalie Goldberg say?
Oh,
Write it even if it's crap.
The first writing workshop I went to was the first person I heard, Nancy Willard. The first rule of writing she gave was allow yourself to write badly, you know.
Yes.
I really try not to judge initially. Again, that sort of spirit of trying to invoke a watercolorist who's going to try to make as few marks as possible was good for me. And it felt like a kind of tuning up from within, you know. But forgive me for repeating myself. It's a little.
So I'm always interested. I says, whoa, there's Karma.
Karma. Hey, Karma.
I have a low level question for you, Rick.
Take all levels. Take all levels. We'll build a house.
How do you know when the poem is done? How do you turn it right?
Right.
Good one.
That's a great question. There's this thing, Peter a moment ago was saying, I love thinking about visual art, and I started as more of a visual artist, I should say, sort of admit to. And the idea of having many canvases is a very living idea for me. I've found too that sometimes, you'll return to a poem, even after it's been published, and you'll find more that you can do with it. And I always feel like my loyalty is to the poem, not to my ego, not to what I think is done, I remember once when I was living in San Francisco, I went to a used bookstore, went to the poetry section, of course, went to the Bees, found a book by Elizabeth Bishop called Questions of Travel, opened it up. Not only was it signed, but as I leafed through it, she had made editorial changes to poems in that book. And I thought, in purple ink, and I thought, if Bishop is doing it, we all should be doing it, Some people have this idea. I respect all the ideas. We don't have to live according to other things. Of course, we can respect them. But I know some people who, will preserve the earlier poem because it was just a reflective of a time. But I guess I'm on a different side of that school, kind of feeling like if I can make the poem better years later, I will try to do that and show it to a trusted reader. But yeah, Karma, it's such a great question because I do think, was it Keats who talked about poems not being finished but abandoned? And we don't want to abandon anything we love or anything we love. Of course we come back. Like, do you have what you need? Oh, wait a minute. You know what? Maybe I can get you better shoes or something like that. And you start sort of finding some other exit to the poem or what have you. But yeah, it's a funny thing, isn't it, Karma? Maybe it's different for prose writers. I would imagine there's just so much more canvas. There's all that going to the fullness of the right margin, the way poets just keep hitting return, the eternal return. But yeah, you can get an aerial view of a poem in a way that you can't get an aerial view always of maybe of a story or even an essay. So every word, of course, gets a kind of profound attention. Yeah, anyway, that's I guess the school of thought I occupy now, maybe later. Yeah, oh yes, please.
One follow-up to that. I have been asking for years. I don't remember that I've asked you this. If I have asked you and you've told me, forgive me.
Oh, please.
But
Maybe I would have remembered you're asking, so it'll be.
I remember, I've been asking myself this a lot recently. How do you know it's a poem? What is it, a poem because the poet intends it to be a poem? Is it a poem? Are there some rules to it? Is there something objective about it? This is a poem, this isn't. I understand that there are many varieties of poems.
And for our next meeting.
Oh, Doug's come to rescue me, Karma, from your incredible question.
That's a big one.
It's such a great question, and I think, I like to think of poems almost as like looking out at the flora and fauna here. No two poems are alike. No, not even two egrets or white ibises. Things that I've actually seen in the last few days, which is miraculous. I'll never see these things in Nashville, or in Carrboro, we may see a heron, right? But no snowy egrets yet. But I want to entertain this question really seriously. I take it terribly seriously. We all know this thing, maybe, like the exhilaration of the early draft. Like, I love writing something and just feeling the exhilaration that something like this new creature, almost a new species, has come into being at the bottom, through me into the world, and, initially, I don't know, I know that it feels like a poem, but it's so new. I haven't, unless say it's one of the recent love poems I've been writing. And so sending to my sweetheart and getting a pretty immediate, response, sometimes a callback, which seems like elevates, the sort of what constitutes a joyous response. But I think this is something, I like to think of poetry as a slow food. Do you know what I mean? It's not a fast food, I think, and I think too, like, I found myself saying this maybe to some of you, so forgive me if it's repeating myself. I know I've said it to my sweetheart, probably to Georgia, maybe to Peter and Robin too at different points, but I feel like with poetry in particular, it's like a palace of humility, where when you think you found the last room, you always find another door. And you have to open into another room that may present whole other circumstances for being humble. And I feel that way about poems too, poem to poem. Like, what is it? You may get the essential gestures of a poem, which is to say, funny to think, like in visual art, you think of the gestures of the brush work or the gestures of paint on canvas. And with a poet, it's sort of like the gestures of the lines on the page. One thing you guys couldn't see, and I'm sorry about this, many of the poems have a kind of shape to them in this collection. These stanzas that kind of wind a bit and have these variable lines. I haven't talked about that yet. And I promise, Karma, I'm not trying to lead your question. It's just like a little divertimento in the question. But sometimes, and I don't know if you guys have ever found that you've needed this, but I found that in that noise of, the sort of Trumpian horns being blown and a certain kind of rhetoric and its poisons and toxins, that it even, I suppose too, with certain kind of news being available all the time, that I needed to create a form that would entirely transport my attention and occupy my attention, and, with every step, with every line, I would need to remember that line, like the first stanza would sort of dictate the sort of heartbeat of the stanza, the stanza, right? Yeah. And so anyway, how did I know it was done? With these individual poems, you all would answer this. There was this feeling like, you're writing towards something. I didn't always know, meaning to me is such a magical term, but and I don't want to shroud it in mystery, but I do think in some ways it's properly kept, with its shadow, so to speak, the meaning itself, it's so many things. And do we begin the poem like as a tract? It seems like with political speech, there can be definitely a thing that you want to communicate. And with the poem, with so many of these poems, the meaning was a discovered thing, not a prescribed thing, and that's an interesting thing to think about too, just in like what a poem can be and what a poem can do. I mean, not even necessarily for the listeners like you guys have so graciously been, but to the poet. For me, I was coming to these poems to be transformed, to be, to detox from these other uses of language. And so when I got to a place, very often it could be at the bottom of the page, and feeling the sense of nearing an exit, getting close to the sense of nearing a door, I would find the door, and it's actually quite remarkable. And again, a kind of part of the mystery of the process. But I guess I want to say too, like when you're writing every day, I mean, I can only ever compare this to gymnastics metaphorically. I've never done it, but I admire it so much. But I think, you get used to like the length of your routine, or you get used to, it's not getting used to so much, but maybe viscerally in your body, you get a sense of how the poem should feel by the end, and when you've gone far enough in the poem. And to some extent, the only reliable like barometer or measuring device is your own sense of joy, your own sense of being transformed, your own sense of beauty, truth, those big things that we seldom talk about enough. that's entirely guide us, you know, if we're trying to be honest and want to be. You know. So in some sense, karma, I had to rely on my best sense of those things. And then later, again, if I felt like I had a better line, I would always smuggle it, you know. Because, you know, of course, as a poet, you're the CEO, but you're also always the janitor, which I suppose comes out of humility. You know, you're always doing the cleanup, and it's actually very gratifying to be all of that, the high and the low. And, you know, Karma, you were saying earlier that these are going to be low order questions. They were not actually. They were almost like Socratic questions. They like got really the root of things, like a good question by Socrates.
Excellent questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
I almost wonder if after listening to what you were talking about, Rick, that there's still a remarkable number of people who like a formal prosody because of its tight shapes, music, line length, you know, and probably what happens with the rest of us, as you were describing, is that you come up with your own.
Yes.
And how you work out the spatial relationships between the meanings, the sounds, the phrasing, and all the rest of it. It comes with a long investment in the process.
Definitely. No, that's beautifully put, Doug. I should say too that, you know, I do have one little sonnet sequence in here. It's a short little crown of sonnets, you know, and I love writing in form from time to time very much. There can be a gift in the receive form in that, like, there's an already pre-established exit strategy, right?
Exactly. The last two, yeah, the couplet.
Couplet, right? So there's that. There are all these other kinds of things, even in stealth rhyme, or what I sometimes think of as dyslexic rhyme, where I'll respell the word I might be rhyming. I smuggle those letters into a whole other word, you know. I have a sestina in my second book. You know, I worked with a wonderful formalist who just retired now, maybe a couple of years ago, named Mark Jarman, amazing poet.
Charming, yeah.
He said the first poet that he discovered on his own was Theodore Roethke. And Roethke would write in form and was a great writer of free verse. And I'd like to try to sort of, insofar as it's possible, emulate that kind of capacity if possible. James Merrill, another great poet who wrote magisterially in form. And does he have poems in free verse? He does, doesn't he? Yeah, I mean, he just a magnificent example. And so those have been in some ways my examples. But in this book, you'll find at least one sonnet sequence. And I do feel like, you know, I had written a long poem as sonnets, and I needed my own bit of a jailbreak after that. You know, I needed to turn to kind of the 21st century poem, but in some ways on my own terms. And I don't know, like you work a lot with certain end rhymes for a while, even in a stealthy way. And you're always thinking about how you're ending a line, you know, if it's a satisfying word, sonically, syllabically, yeah. But so much of it comes down to music, I think, for me too.
Yes.
Poetry, as Walter Pater said, aspires to the condition of music. And wow, I'm hoping that many of these poems had a musical dimension to you. The image, I mean, this is maybe a strange anecdote, but with Peter in the room, it's hard for me not to think about the time I was a resident in James Merrill's house and for a fellowship, for a semester-long fellowship, you know, got someone to do the Ouija board with me. And one of the questions asked was, where is home? And the word came up almost immediately, the image, you know. And for a writer to think of the image as being home, maybe in some ways that connects a bit to the first poem, or the, you know, the idea of the poem as, you know, this thing that, you know, delivers the goods when you can no longer deliver those goods, you know. And maybe that's a bit of a revenge of the poem on experience, you know, and a revenge for the poet on certain experiences, or not even just the poet, but for those the poet may go into the poem. Yeah.
Well, you've hit on so many just gushing, florid issues and images. I'd love to spend the rest of the afternoon talking about it. There's a hunger that goes along with it because we don't get a chance to do this very often. We need to make more opportunities for it, for these great questions and responses. I really appreciate that each of you were here today and participated and listened to Rick, and you're going to find the joy of actually perusing his new book, my Mr. Clemente. There it is. Yeah, and he even has. I never imagined him with wings, but I think you've got it right.
Yeah, wings. I think were a very important addition. You can also see there are little paper airplanes flying around him.
Yes.
Yeah, really good. Thank you all. Thank you again, Doug, and thank you everyone at Bookstore One, Georgia, Robin, Stephanie, Peter, who are here with me literally, and to everyone.
A marvelous reading and event. Thanks so much, Rick.
Thank you.
And to you all.
Thanks, Rick.